Welcome to another episode of M&A Plus, The Art After the Deal, where we discuss strategies and insights that make post-M&A operations and leadership thrive. Today, I am happy to be joined by Aaron Mikulsky, the author of the book entitled Love to Lead, A Journey of Self-Reflection, Significance, and Servant Leadership. Aaron is a multifaceted operations and leadership consultant with a wealth of experience across industries. From using Lean Six Sigma to build successful business units to navigating the complexities of corporate transitions, Aaron brings unique insights on how to lead and strategize during and after major corporate transactions. And here's a twist. Aaron and I are also going to discuss applying game theory to business roles and responsibilities during a transition or integration. This will be a great conversation that includes real-world examples and innovative approaches to post-deal success. So welcome to the show, Aaron. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm very excited to have this great discussion today.
Good. So first, I wanted to just give you an opportunity to provide some background information about your journey towards writing Love to Lead and some of your experience that you've gained in operations and your Six Sigma background.
Certainly. So as my 26-year journey in corporate America was coming to an end, and I was kind of given a year in advance that was going to be the case, and during the thick of COVID, I'm sitting around not doing any business travel or work travel, and I was thinking, how do I more effectively use my time versus sitting around and binge watching like so many people took up that hobby during COVID. And I decided, you know what, I've been reading a book a week on average for over 2 decades. And I tend to read business biographies, a lot of history, a lot of books on psychology, human behavior, and tons on leadership. I've just always been drawn to that. And I'm thinking, although the world did not need another book on leadership, I was going to take my collective wisdom and my corporate experience and try to put my spin on it. And my goal was to create a book that was short, took out a lot of the fluff, made the examples very concise, and something that you could put in your purse, put in a briefcase, knapsack, and read it on a short flight. So that was really the genesis of Love to Lead. And interestingly enough, as I published that book, people started coming out of the woodwork and thinking that I was a much more credible person now that I wrote a book, even though it probably wasn't the case. Just probably became a little bit better writer and definitely humbled me in my writing. But people were asking, can you help me become a more effective leader? Can you help come into my organization, work with my leadership team to instill some of these skills with them? Could you work with my team on revamping our strategy, or in startup world, creating a strategy? So really the book served me and others in many different ways. And because of the interest, I formed my company, Love to Lead Consulting Services, pretty much due to the demands and interest in the premises of the book.
Right. So I did actually have a chance to read your book as well, Love to Lead, and I was actually really impressed. So I had the same thought as you did about, oh, it's another book about leadership, and how many of these do I need to read? I've read a lot of books as well, and you're right. I thought this one was really concise. It's short and to the point, and you've got some really awesome citations in here, and you kind of hit all of the main topics in a really concise way that you may read about in other books, but you also have your own spin on it. So I actually enjoyed the book a lot, and I actually started taking pictures of some of the pages and sending them to my daughter, because there was some, she's just started college, and there's a lot of good antidotes to how to be happy, what does success really mean, and things like that. And my daughter and I have had those conversations. So once I'm done with this book, I'm going to give this book to her and she's going to read it. she's really interested. I like the fact that it also pinpoints kind of the important part of leadership, which is related to self discovery and reflection and being humble. I mean, you just demonstrated that you have a humbleness to you. So that's actually something that's helped me a lot. The more humble I am and the more curious and self-reflective that I am, it does help. Has helped me in my situations with, different leadership situations that I've had. So I have a couple of areas of the book that I wanted to maybe just point out for the audience here. Maybe you could discuss a little bit, but you go into a lot of explanation about what servant leadership is. And I know we've heard that a lot, but I think it's something that works. I mean, I've seen it work for me, and it's not a fluffy thing to say, servant leadership. It actually does work, and it really does pull a team together. Like I've noticed, because I'm kind of naturally maybe a servant leader in my leadership style, but it does, in my experience, pull the team together really, in a very strong way. So I wanted to hear your insights on servant leadership.
There's a lot of different philosophies on leadership, as we know, and you look at over time, whether it be the military, whether it be history, and this is just always resonated with me. And there is some religious, biblical, spiritual elements to it, certainly. And I'm not embarrassed to say that I'm a Christian, but I'm a student of world religions. And I believe that this is rooted in really caring for and nurturing of others. And like I mentioned in my book, my one word definition of leadership really evolved from the John Maxwell definition of leadership being influence. And although I believe influence is a huge piece of leadership, I've really changed that one word definition over time from influence to love. And I just believe that the leaders that I've always looked up to and admired and have gravitated towards, and the leaders that I would, fight really hard to, I go into battle with them, right? Because I believe them, trust them, just would do whatever I could, to meet those objectives. It's because of who they are, the person that they are, and how they treat others. So it becomes very magnetic, I think. And although I think you can meet short-term objectives with different, more dictatorial or authoritative leadership styles, and there's a time and a place for that, right? And in battle and crisis, when the life is at stake, things like that. But I think servant leadership serves humanity best for the long term. And I use the love word and then created that to an acronym that I felt are the four biggest components that define leadership. And we can talk about those, or your audience could just read the book and understand what LOVE stands for.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just read it because I have it right here. So,
Sure.
love means learning along with teaching, optimistic attitude, vision and values, and engagement of people and consequent relationships. So that's the LOVE. So that's cool that you came up with that. So another chapter you talk about the difference between management and leadership, and I think that's another important concept. And the quote that you have on here is really good, so I'm going to read that as well. So basically, managers light a fire under people, and leaders light a fire in people. So how do leaders light a fire in people?
So I like to say that leaders don't motivate people. You can't motivate another person. Motivation comes from within, but leaders can inspire people. So it's really setting the tone, setting the environment, positive reinforcement, giving constructive feedback the right way so people can improve, to challenge them to grow and stretch themselves. And it's really from a place of, again, service. It's not beating people down when they make a mistake. It's pointing it out, learning from it, moving on, not making the same mistake again. So it's not just failing fast like our friends in Silicon Valley like to talk about. It's learning
Mhm.
fast. And it's a
Mhm.
different way of leading versus fear and intimidation and penalizing
Mhm.
people versus really inspiring people to give them their best selves each and every day, to put forth the best effort. And then, we as leaders need
Mhm.
to make sure that we're putting them in the right places to succeed, the right positions and the right environment, giving them the right
Mhm.
projects or tasks. So that's really the difference between leadership and management. And I'll say too, the biggest thing too is I feel like we manage things, but we lead people. So we treat and
Mhm.
should treat things very different than we treat people.
And the last thing in your book that I thought was really interesting was the last chapter where you talk about, see what it's called, moments of change and crisis. And of course, in my business space, because we work with M&A transitions and there's a lot of change, and that's like in the workplace, that's like a period of time that's, has a lot of pressure, a lot of change in roles, and so I kind of gravitated toward this chapter, and I thought it was really interesting that you have music as a way that can help people through those changes and those crises.
Again, I wrote this at the very beginning of COVID. There was just so much uncertainty and unknown and fear, quite frankly. And again, you can think of my O in love being optimism. And although leaders may be fearful of the unknown and that uncertainty, and you want to be authentic, but you also have to put on that happy face and be optimistic and positive in those tough times. Because if you feel like the
Mhm.
ship is going down, everyone else is going to just go crazy and create, chaos and mayhem. So again, the leadership sets the tone. And
Mhm.
if the leader isn't taking good care of themselves, I like to say self-care is team care, right?
Mhm.
That the leader has to look out for their own personal health so they can be their best selves on the job and again set that example. But in the adversity, any time of chaos, for me personally in the
Mhm.
past, it has been music that has brought me calm, that has helped me relax. It changes people. It unites our soul, and it's provided me comfort in some very dark times. And
Mhm.
that was just more of a personal example of how something in the environment or something that we can do can put us in a better mental state so we can tackle
Mhm.
those difficult challenges.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So tell us a little bit more about your leadership consulting business that you have. Do you work with different industries, or and kind of how do you approach your consulting engagements?
I do. Really, what I found quite interesting, because I've been in financial services and commercial property casualty insurance essentially my entire professional career. But I found the most joy in all the positions that I've held, including doing the project management, problem solving work, and the Lean Six Sigma and strategy work. I've still found that I found the most joy in working with people, developing people, seeing people grow in their careers, getting promoted, and seeing where sometimes they aren't believing in themselves or don't think that they could tackle a certain problem. And then by me or other leaders, sometimes seeing more in them than they see in themselves, inspiring them to
Mm-hmm.
push forward, to challenge themselves, to learn and grow. And then you see that light bulb go off, that you see them succeed. And I just have found the most joy and fulfillment in my career
Mm-hmm.
when individuals are in that state and when to see them progress. And, I loved working with the senior leadership teams, facilitating strategy sessions, a lot of culture change movements, working with change management and human resources and
Mm-hmm.
senior leaders to say, okay, this is the culture that we have today. This is the culture that we need to have in the future to thrive. Now,
Mm-hmm.
how do we get there? So, given all my love for leadership, I've really worked now with individuals and leadership teams to create the cultures that they want, to create the
Mm-hmm.
strategy that's going to set them up for future success. But doing that, it's kind of interesting because that's how I started my business. And then it's kind of evolved to one-on-one executive coaching. And a lot of that is I'd
Mm-hmm.
work with people on their teams doing, say, the strategy work or management consulting work. But then they would come to me and say, Aaron, I really like your style. I like the chemistry. Could you coach me to be a more effective leader? Or I have some of these skill gaps that I've been told, can you help me in these areas? And
Mm-hmm.
I've just loved doing that. And probably 80% of my business now is more doing that executive coaching. And sometimes that evolves into career coaching if they're not happy in their job or if they get laid off or they want to move to that next level. Say they're a COO and they want to be the CEO, or they're some of my newer clients, they're more at that VP level, but they want to get to the C-suite. So I've been
Mm-hmm.
hired and kind of acting as a career coach for some of these people. Or
Mm-hmm.
the other thing I did during COVID too is I became a certified life coach. So I found too with all these individuals I work with, a lot of times I have to put on my life coaching hat because like I talk about in my book, I don't think there is a huge difference between work life and personal life in the balance of such. I think especially for people at very senior levels, it's more about work life integration, and people's personal lives
Mm-hmm.
dramatically affect their work lives and vice versa. So
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting how, just thinking about some of the clients I've even worked with this past week, how many times I had to change hats from life coach to career coach to executive coach.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine. I mean, I've gone through some really challenging times, and I wanted to talk to somebody about my personal life and my business at the same time because it both affects each other for sure. So, what would you say, like, if you're coaching somebody that is kind of trying to reach the next level in their career, what are some like maybe the top two or three things that you feel like are the most important for those people to focus on?
I really think that differs based on the individual and what they're good at versus maybe there's a glaring hole and there's a reason why they haven't gotten to that next level. And sometimes they spend way too much time doing repair or trying to fix a weakness that it's maybe better
Mm-hmm.
for them to just hire some complementary person to kind of fill that gap and spend more time on strengthening the strengths. But I also advise people too, if there's a glaring weakness for a core competency or a skill set for that next role, as an example, let's just say they're great at operations, but they're have no financial acumen whatsoever and they want to be CEO. You have to be competent in the numbers, right? So you could have the best CFO, there, but still you have to be good enough to be able to challenge them and ask them the right questions. So I think it's rare to have an effective CEO that that at least isn't competent in finance and can speak the accounting
Hmm.
speak. So that to me, that's just something that they need to be aware of if that is their ambition. I'm not going to teach them and train them that, that's that's
Hmm.
something more specialized, but it's more of bringing that to the surface and making them more aware of that so they know how to
Hmm.
focus their time and where they need to improve.
Do you think a lot of people don't know what they're good at, or they think they're good at something and they're not?
I'll give you one example. One of the first clients that I had as an executive coach doing one-on-one work, he
Hmm.
was the founder of the company. The company was taken over by a private equity firm, and he was told by the new chairman that he needed an executive coach for several different reasons. And I knew the individual who recommended that he get a coach, and he reached out to me, and I was working with this gentleman for probably 8 months, and after that time I just went back to the person I knew and I said, I just don't feel right taking your money and spending more time on this because I'm not going to use his name, but he's so unaware of his glaring weaknesses. And I talked to his entire leadership team individually and essentially did a personalized 360 review and anonymously gave him the feedback. And there's glaring patterns, and he was just in denial. He thought he was an exceptional leader, great communicator, inspired everyone, and yet everyone else said the contrary. And every other week when we met, it was just it was brutal because I didn't even look forward to it. I actually, when I saw it always pop up on my calendar, I'm like, oh, this is going to be like Groundhog's Day again today because we're going to be talking the same stuff, and he's going to be defensive, and we just weren't making the progress that was needed. And there's probably some incremental improvements here and there, but I came to the realization very quickly that I wasn't the right person for him. I don't know if anyone is, quite frankly, but how can I help someone that truly doesn't want to be helped? And I've been more selective, honestly, with the people that I meet with in my prospecting conversations, because if they don't have that humility and that learning leader mindset, honestly, I don't care to work with people like that.
Yeah, if somebody's not ready or they're not willing to do what's necessary to make, grow personally, then yeah, it's not going to work. There's nothing any coach can do about it, right? Okay, so I wanted to switch to talking about some operation stuff that we talked about previously.
Sure.
So you had gave me some examples and information about your experience building new business units, and especially applying when you were talking about applying Six Sigma methodologies to that. And I wanted to hear a little bit about, how you do that. What have you done?
Sure. Well, I've had the opportunity twice in my career now to form a Lean Six Sigma organization in two large publicly traded companies. And the first was when I went through my black belt training and learned problem solving methodologies, learned to be a project manager, learned about change management, how to identify problems, define the problem, analyze it, using the data and analytics in order to come up with solutions to design new processes or systems, or improve the current ones if they're repairable. And this, and then setting really the metrics and the measurement system in place to make sure that the people don't resort back to their old ways. So that to me was just a wonderful education in and of itself, because you can go to school and learn about this but applying it and working on all these different projects
Mm-hmm.
to improve the business across the entire organization and a global organization, that allowed me to work so many in so many different areas and get me exposure to areas that I would have never had the opportunity to be engrossed in if it wasn't for that. Fast forward many years later, one of the reasons why I was brought to the last publicly traded company I work for was to run all of their insurance operations, but also start up a new operational excellence team in which I hired some really talented master black belts across a lot of different industries to not only work on the biggest, most challenging projects, but also to train individuals who are identified across the in organization who are the high performers, high potential employees to make them better business people, to make them better business thinkers. And they would work on the most pressing opportunities or problems within their areas. And once kind of that ended, they now acquired all those skill sets that I mentioned previously that I got when I went through that program years prior, so that they were just much greater assets to the organization. And one of the things that I'm very prideful on, and I know pride could be a dirty word sometimes, but I'm just so happy with all the people that went through that program that have just excelled in their careers and have gotten promoted in the organization, or some that have left and just seen their careers take off. And it's really because of all those skills and that experience that we essentially provided them.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of shift, still stick to the operations topic and your operations experience, but I wanted to shift a little bit into the M&A world just so we can address some of your experience in the M&A world, specifically during transitions and integration activities. So one of the things is that many people confuse a transition phase with integration or combine the two. I separate the two. So how would you differentiate between transition and integration during acquisition or divestiture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've seen this debated quite often, and even the terms used simultaneously. If you want my quick summary, I would say generally transition is first, integration comes later. I think they are two different stages. Sometimes because of the sake of time, many times they just got blurred together. In the ideal world, you do the transition, you do the integration. It's very thoughtful,
Mm-hmm.
and those tasks and activities are laid out. It's just like anything else. You may need to do A, B, and C before you do D and F.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times you have big issues is when you're doing things later down that conveyor belt, if you will, but you haven't done some of the foundational things prior. Then you're doing a lot of rework, or you're coming up with different conclusions, or you're how you're solving the problem is different because, well, you didn't do the proper transition. The roles and responsibilities, if they're not clear at either one of these, it gets
Mm-hmm.
really messy. And then it's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blaming. But at the end of the day, if you're the acquirer, if you're
Mm-hmm.
the purchaser, it's really on you to make sure that you're getting what you need from who you just acquired. So
Mm-hmm.
the more you could kind of set it up for success, even before the transaction goes through, setting the expectations of here's what we're going to need from you and people's names and dedicated time for that transition, and
Mm-hmm.
make sure that that's solid, then the integration is so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what happens, you may say a lot of the people that are helping you with the transition, once you're a combined entity, many times these happen because you want to save costs, right? It's all economies of scale, save costs. I don't need two IT departments. I don't need two HR departments. I don't need two accounting, so a lot of that foundation or the overhead, corporate overhead becomes redundant. So that
Mhm.
gets whittled away. Well, some of the people maybe that were working with you on the transition, they may not be with you anymore at the
Mhm.
integration piece. So that's why you have to be, I think, very thoughtful as far as what do you need to get from whom by when. So I don't know if that
Mhm.
answers your question, or you think I'm crazy, or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, it does answer it. I mean, it's really about planning, and like if you plan and do a good transition, you're basically getting organized, you're getting stuff to a certain state, you're already identifying things that may or may not be needed in integration, so you're not wasting time with things that you don't need. And a lot of those early identification and early planning is going to actually make integration a lot smoother and a lot less costly, I guess, if you want to talk about overhead. So I think that's kind of what you're saying also, because the tasks and the team, like you said, are different during the transition phase than what's going to end up, the structure might end up being a little different in the integration phase. So that's another consideration. And you mentioned roles and responsibilities. So this goes into the next segment, which I wanted to just let the audience know that I wrote an article on how game theory applies to transitions during a merger or acquisition, because I've been on many large scale transitions and focusing on contract transition and legal review. So I noticed that when there's a buyer and a seller, often the roles and responsibilities aren't defined, or the buyer and the seller have the same responsibilities. And then
Hmm.
there's all this overlap and it contributes to all this chaos. And one team thinks they're supposed to be doing this, and then the other team also thinks they're reinventing spreadsheets, and they're reinventing, all kinds of documents and things. And so I feel like there's a lot of wasted time and inefficiency because of that. So I said, so how about we make it clear who's doing what, and we decide who's doing what based on their interest level, because their interest is going to determine how much focus that they're actually going to have and whether they care about actually getting the obligation done. So I can give them a quick example here. So like if the in my mind, the buyer should have the responsibility of executing the transition of those contracts, actually getting those contracts in place, because that's what they're purchasing and that's what their interest is. And the buyer can then also act on opportunities that come up during those reviews and transitions. The seller should be obligated, and I'm more talking about post close, like close date, at close date and beyond. The seller should only be obligated to provide all of the documents and any information that is connected to those documents, or any historical information about it. And that's it. And that way the buyer has all the documents and they can do their execution, a lot more quickly. So I've seen the situation where the sellers are involved in the process way after close happens, to the point where everybody's stepping over each other and redoing things and things like that. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on whether you think it makes sense to apply game theory in that aspect, and maybe in other situations as well.
Yeah, I think so. And even some of my clients, when a PE firm buys, spin off or carve out, and like you said, a lot of times it's not until the close date that a lot of this detail gets hammered out. But boy, the sooner the better. If you could do more due diligence up front, kind of, way before close, sometimes that unearths some major issues or concerns, or identify that there's major contracts here that we just can't get out of, or too much of a drag on expenses, that maybe the deal doesn't look as good, now that we know more way after the fact. But I'm thinking back to a project that I worked on many years ago, in which the firm I was working for acquired another firm. And it was actually a Lean Six Sigma project. And we had to go through working with the procurement group to look at all the contracts and see what where there was redundancy in their contracts with the same vendors many times. But where could we possibly renegotiate or kind of merge the two? Which ones should be terminated? All those type of things. So, the one thing, and this seems so obvious to me, kind of serving as an impartial project manager, really, but people were just stepping over themselves and just had no idea how to organize themselves. And I had to bring together procurement, operations, legal. I brought in a project manager. A lot of the contracts were IT or facilities, and just getting the right people in the room saying, we're going to work on this project. Here are the steps. Here's a methodology to follow. Divide and conquer. Talking about just roles and responsibilities. It's the old accountability matrix. Everyone kind of knew what the process was, who was accountable for what, how do we evaluate this, and it's the same thing if you're a buyer and a seller. It's just again, it may sound super simple, but I'm just amazed how many times this just doesn't happen. It's who's doing what when, and just get
Mhm.
organized. And that's why, and I learned this years ago from an excellent project manager that had a ton of experience on M&A stuff specifically. And I learned so much from her. But a lot of project managers that they'll bring into these type of things, they've never experienced that before, so they miss a lot of things. But yeah, I think you're right, is just having extremely clear roles and responsibilities and accountabilities for the buyers and sellers in a transaction, like you said, is critical. But it's most critical for the acquirer, because at the end of the day, once you buy something, now you're accountable, right? Now this is your thing that you just acquired, whether whether you like it or not. And everything I've read, 2/3 of acquisitions don't meet expectations. I don't want to say fail, but they do fail to meet expectations. And a lot of it isn't because it sounded good at the time. It's because of poor execution.
Right. Exactly. And you mentioned, people that are assigned to these types of situations that don't have experience, and that kind of makes it worse. And I noticed that that's sometimes the case because, people that are already working in these companies are pulled in to do things that are very much related to a transition or preparing for integration, but it's kind of a unique process that needs to happen, and it's better done by people that have experience so they can plan and actually foresee how to kind of make that work. Otherwise, there's a lot of chaos. So the competence is actually important too. Experience and competence of the people that are assigned to some of those key activities. I often see just people thrown into it, and I mean, they're not going to necessarily know how to even start, where to start.
The other thing we haven't talked a ton about, I did when I was talking about what I do in my consulting business, but is around culture. And
Hmm.
with mergers and acquisitions, I've seen this firsthand, but I've also read just so many examples of, well, we acquired this company because it looked great on a spreadsheet. And I still believe that if you want to acquire someone, you can make anything look good on a spreadsheet. But there's too little attention to the culture fit. We've seen this and we read about this is two companies, they're both huge and very different cultures, and then you cram them together. And even after taking advantages of the economies of scale for the actual operating business units that are bringing in the revenue, the way that they do that is so different that it becomes an us versus them, and it
Mhm.
can be a toxic environment for years. And I don't think there's enough emphasis on evaluating that prior to entertaining some of these deals. I don't know what your thought is on that.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, I could have a whole podcast just on that topic. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because I did have a podcast with a psychologist who's also a lawyer. And then I recently spoke with one of my alumni, a fellow alum from my college, my university, who is also a psychologist. And he's actually looking into how to apply some of his psychology learnings to the M&A space. And one of the things we talked about was how do you put a value on the culture fit that you're buying or lack thereof, right? Like, is there like, can you come up with a rating or a number or something that can show that so that a value could be put onto it? I think that would be useful because that is like a huge area where people have the biggest issues when there's a merger and acquisition, especially when a large company buys a small startup or a small, I mean, or a family owned company, or, it's the culture is vastly different, and it's very hard to work around all those things. And it may not have been worth it to purchase it if that was something that was, researched. It was more researched or evaluated, I guess. So that's a good point. Maybe I should do a topic on just that in a future podcast. So Aaron, so thanks. I appreciate you being here. Is there any like final takeaways, in the operations or leadership world that you might just throw out there, some advice that you might give people in the space?
The flavor of the month is ChatGPT and large language models and all that. But whether it be M&A or just business in general, I still firmly believe that it's all about people. It's people that create great processes and systems. It's people that create the technology, and it's people that change the world and for the good and bad. And the more that we can remember that and have that sense of humanity,
Mhm.
I think the better. And technology is wonderful. It's a wonderful tool, but it's an enabler, and we can't neglect the people part.
Yeah, as much as AI is trying to develop its own emotions or be like people, it's not going to happen. Where can we find your book and your website? And you have more
Uh,
than one
I
book, by the way. So,
I do, yeah. So you can find me on lovetolead.biz. So the two is the number two. Lovetolead.biz is my website. You can find me on YouTube. I have some things there, but it's mostly LinkedIn. I try to post a couple times a week on LinkedIn. I also have a blog on my website that I write and post weekly. There's hundreds of blog posts there. And yeah, you mentioned my second book. So my second book is called Monday Motivation, and that's over 500 pages. So very different than my first book. But really, what that is, it's an accumulation of weekly emails that I sent out during the 6.5 years I was at one of my employers, and it was really meant to jumpstart their week, create some momentum into their week, create some motivation and inspiration that really they were lacking when I took over all of insurance operations and spent the first 30 to 60 days sitting down with people. It just seems like they were demoralized, and they needed to know that they had a leader that cared about them and that was there, that someone that really appreciated the work that they did, and sitting down with them and seeing them do the work and asking questions without judgment, which is very hard for me to do, by the way, or come up with solutions very quickly when I see them doing things inefficiently. I think sending out those weekly emails consistently, never missed a week in 6.5 years, really meant something to people. And I knew that, and that's why I continued doing that. But when I knew my there was going to be an end at that organization, my wonderful executive assistant kind of poached this is, Aaron, have you ever thought about combining all these and writing a book about Monday motivation? That's what I titled the weekly emails. And I told her, I said, not really, but it makes sense now. You can kind of organize them based on theme, and you categorize them the best you could. So it's meant to not be read cover to cover, but if you want to learn something and read a quick half page or page article on leadership or communication or innovation or strategy or success, or you could just turn to that chapter and read something. And really my inspiration from what I wrote was what I was reading normally that week. So I would be reading a book or read an article. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I think I'm going to share this with people. So I'd summarize it and share. As you know, reading my first book, I love quotes. I love to share really insightful, interesting things that people much, much smarter than I have written. I view myself as almost like an aggregator of wisdom from others and try to package it in a more simplistic way to share with others. So yeah, thank you for mentioning my second book, but you can find a link to purchase both of those books on LinkedIn, on my website. I don't make a dime from either one of those books. I donate all the proceeds to the American Cancer Society in memory of my mom. It's really about giving back and sharing and helping others in any way. And that's why I wrote those books.
Good. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you joining us today and spending some time, talking to me about these topics. I will also add the links, all your links to the books and to your website on the show notes so people can find it there also. So thanks for being with us, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you for joining today's episode of M&A Plus, The Art After the Deal. A big thank you to Aaron for sharing his invaluable insights on leadership, operations, and strategy. We've learned about everything from Lean Six Sigma's impact on building business units to the intriguing application of game theory in managing roles post-acquisition. If you want to learn more about Aaron's consulting services or go deeper into the topics discussed today, be sure to check out Aaron's books and the links in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to M&A Plus for more expert-driven episodes that help you master the art after the deal. So see you next time. Bye for now.